the key pieces here. Okay, so normally I would basically kind of do a bit of a debrief, but like I said, what I'm going to do is just sort of ask, was anybody able to kind of, how many of you were still negotiating and had not kind of gotten there? Maybe just a quick sort of show of hands of folks that were sort of still going back and forth and discussing, et cetera. All right, I'm just scrolling through here. Okay, and so that's fine, and that makes sense. How many of you had sort of reached some, did anybody come up with some kind of an agreement or some way forward that worked for you? And if you did, maybe just put a quick note in the chat box so I could ask you a question or two about that. Or you can sort of raise your hand. Let's see if I, okay, so for the most part, it sounds like people were kind of still continuing to make their way through this. So look, this role play is written in such a way that in many ways that highlights the notion, or on the surface, it highlights the notion that it looks like somebody's going to win and someone's going to lose, right? That you both need 2,000 oranges. There are 3,000, you have a problem. Compromising in the traditional sense of splitting the difference here, each getting 1,500, doesn't really work, right? It doesn't help anybody. And so people try to get creative in some way. I mean, one of the challenges with this role play is that you're told in part that you don't trust the other group, and also that you believe these oranges are yours. And the role play is written in that way because the world often tells us that that's the way a certain situation is, that someone's going to get what they need and the other side's not. And as a result, you know, that's the nature of negotiation. But there is actually a solution where both parties can get what they need. So in the, I think it's the second or third sentence, in one of your roles, it says that you need the rind of the orange, and in the other, it says you need the fruit or the juice. And so if you're able to get to that and ask those questions, so one of the things about negotiation in general is that we make a lot of assumptions about what's happening and what's possible and what people need from a given situation, as opposed to really asking people, what is it that you need? And the key to this scenario is not getting dug in and going back and forth, as the scenario sort of tries to get you to do, right? It tells you that you need to protect this and these are yours and that kind of stuff. And so to resist some of that and to ask the other side questions and basically try to get at, and really the key question here is, do you need the whole orange? And if you don't, and if you do ask that question, then you start down the road of saying, well, actually, it looks like, you know, the chemical that I need is in the rind and the chemical that you need is in the juice. Now, this role play is based on a scenario, a story really, from a book called Getting to Yes, which is a book that was written back in 1981 by the folks at Harvard that I've worked with for many years. And the book really starts with this story. So it looks like somebody found that. That's great. Congratulations. So there's a story at the beginning of Getting to Yes where two young girls are fighting over an orange, and they decide that neither one they can't figure out who should get it, so they decide to just cut it down the middle. And when they do, one of them peels the orange and throws away the peel and eats the fruit, and the other one peels the orange, throws away the fruit, and keeps the peel because they wanted to make a cake. And had they talked about it, they would have gotten they would have each had more. They would have each had, you know, sort of what they needed. The problem often in negotiation is that we don't engage in this way. We engage in a zero-sum win-lose way of thinking, which, as I said before, really your mindset and your way of thinking is critically important to negotiation. And so if you're looking at this situation and you're thinking, okay, there's no solution, someone's going to win, someone's going to lose, what does that look like? And how am I going to win? And in part, you know, the idea here is to try to use persuasion and arguments to try to help the other to see that either HIV, AIDS, or cancer is worse, which is, of course, a ridiculous conversation because they're both awful, and it's really hard to make that case in general. But so the idea is that there are a lot of pressures that push down on us in negotiation to take kind of that win-lose way of doing. And I will tell you, so I don't talk about negotiation as a win-win endeavor all the time, because I don't think that's how life works. But I do believe that there are a lot of times where you may not get everything you want, but you can certainly gain more with a different frame and a recognition that you actually need the other person when it comes to negotiation most of the time. There are some negotiations where you don't, the relationship doesn't matter. But typically when I ask people about that and I say, how many of your negotiations are with people that are sort of a one-off affair as opposed to negotiating with the same folks over and over again? Typically on the low end, so people will say about 80% of the time I'm negotiating with somebody with the same people over and over again. Maybe 20% is, those one-off negotiations. More the norm is 90-10, where the vast majority of your negotiations are with people who you negotiate with over and over again. And this is the key to negotiation that most people miss, which is that negotiation is an interdependent process. They need you and you need them to get where you want to go. And so I don't know if any of you have ever had somebody say to you, well, that's your problem. When you figure it out, let me know. From my point of view, those people don't understand negotiation very well. Because you're going to have to say yes for me to get where I want to go and vice versa. And so there's a really important element there of negotiation that gets lost for most folks. So that's this exercise. There's a lot more to it, and I would normally go into a little more depth, but that's the essence of it, that there is a solution here that meets your needs and interests if you can resist the story that you're being told and what the world around you tells you a negotiation should look like. And I think that is, frankly, one of the bigger challenges that you're going to face in general when it comes to negotiation, is when you start to talk to people at your work or in your world. I think you're going to find that most people's perception of negotiation is a win-lose. How do we deceive people to get the most we can? And that's not the most productive way to negotiate. In fact, that way of negotiating ends up causing you more problems than it helps you. So I shared the roadmap a little bit. So let me share what I would say are some common myths when it comes to negotiation. So the first one is that compromise is synonymous with negotiation. And you might be thinking, some of you might think, well, yeah, I think that's right. It is, or at least that's what I've learned over the years. And let me tell you why I think that's a myth. So when we are so focused on compromise, and in fact, when negotiations get difficult, that's usually the first thing that people do, is they will say, you know what, we're stuck. Let's just split the difference and move on, right? And while that might feel good, and it might give you a little bit of something that you want, it also is a really inefficient way to negotiate, because the problem a lot of the time when you run up against a difficult negotiation issue is that it requires understanding what's really driving people, like the orange and the fruit and the rind. And you don't ever get there because you're just saying, let's split the difference and move on, instead of really exploring what it is that people need in a given situation and whether there's a creative way of satisfying those needs. So I just finished a book that's coming out in August. It's called Real World Negotiations, and it's case studies from basically the world of business, government, and sort of the other realm. And the book, part of the reason that I wanted to write the book is because I wanted to push against this very notion that effective negotiation is about compromise, because there are 25 cases in the book, and virtually all of them are about creativity and about getting down to what's really important to people. And when people did that, what you see is that compromise was not necessary, because they were able to find a solution that actually worked for them, that really met their needs. And these cases run the gamut from, regular domestic business cases to international cases to peace processes between countries. And so it's really important in my mind that you can always compromise. That can always be part of the deal. But it should be the last stop on the train, not the first. It shouldn't be your default. It should be the thing that you go to if you're really stuck and you've tried to get creative and really understand what people need. Then if you really can't get there and you've tried hard, then maybe compromise comes into play. But when I say try hard, to me, what makes negotiation, what makes effective negotiation is persistence and resilience. So if somebody goes down a road and says, well, we tried to negotiate, and I will say to them, well, what does that mean? What, you tried to negotiate. What'd you do? And they said, well, I made an offer. They didn't like it. They made an offer. I didn't like it. And we decided that, you know, we were too far apart and that was it. And I'm like, well, then you didn't negotiate, because there was way more you could do. And, you know, the best negotiators that I've worked with at Harvard and other places, for them, it's all about how do I flip a problem 6 different ways until I find the solution that's out there. There is a bit of a sense that, you know, these negotiations are problems to be solved in those people's minds. And so if one avenue is blocked, if you've tried one way to reach a deal or reach an agreement to solve a problem or whatever, then use avenue B, C, and D as part of this process. So that's why I call it a myth. And like I said, it really limits your thinking about what's possible in a negotiation. And that's why it's dangerous from my point of view. The second myth, reaching agreement is the mark of success in negotiation. Okay, so now you're really thinking this guy is nuts. Like, of course, that's what you're doing in negotiation. However, if the focus of what you're doing in your mind is that the purpose of negotiation, if the purpose for you of negotiation is to reach agreement, then that becomes your goal. And the reason that's a problem is because there are a lot of bad agreements out there. And as a result, you know, just reaching an agreement doesn't really mean you've succeeded. And frankly, from my point of view, like I've seen a lot of bad agreements where people walked away and said, okay, we reached the agreement, this is great. And then they got back, they started implementing it, and they realized that it actually didn't help them at all. It didn't meet any of their needs or goals. So differently, what you ought to be thinking about is that the purpose of negotiation is to meet your objective as best as possible, however you define that, right? So your objective is the goal, is the bullseye on the target, not reaching agreement. And I think when you do that, first of all, it takes pressure off you to reach agreement. And especially within your organization, you know, if you talk to your boss or somebody and say, look, here's how I'm thinking about negotiation. If we can reach an agreement because it meets these 3 criteria, then that's great. And we should do that. But if it doesn't, I think we're better off walking away. And so you get alignment about these ideas and what's important, okay? And, you know, I mentioned that a lot of the challenges in negotiation are internal to you and the way you think about things. So there's a concept in negotiation called agreement bias. And basically what that means is that the closer you get to an agreement, the more you covet it, and the more you don't want to leave the negotiation without achieving that. Because even in the back of your mind, if you know that it's really your objectives that are most important here and not reaching agreement, you're still going to be pulled in that direction, because we still tend to think that success is related to reaching agreement, and failure, you know, is not reaching agreement. And I would really encourage you to change your framing there, because when I did that, when I learned about this, I thought, okay, so if I know what my objectives are and I go through this process and I realize at the end that it doesn't make sense for me to reach agreement, like I could actually do better elsewhere, then I'm good with that. And I can actually, it makes it easier for me to walk away and say, you know what, this wasn't the right situation, or this wasn't the right agreement for me. And that gives you an opportunity to come back when it does make sense, et cetera. But basically, bottom line is that your objectives, what it is that you're trying to achieve, should be your guiding principle, not this idea of reaching agreement, okay? Somebody wrote, what trends have you seen in healthcare? That's a long conversation. I'm assuming in part it's also trends in healthcare vis-a-vis negotiation. Um, and I will say just in most industries, I mean, I've been in the training world in addition to teaching. I have my own consulting company. And so I've been in the training world for about 15 years. And the trends that I'm seeing are increasingly toward sort of this interest-based approach to negotiation and recognizing that the relationships are a key aspect of negotiating effectively over the long term. Is, you know, the core idea with any negotiation is meeting your short-term interest, but not at the expense of the long-term relationship. And a lot of times people think that it's either or, and it can't be, especially if your negotiations are with people you're going to be dealing with over and over again. So the trends in general are to recognize that there's a way to negotiate that does both of those. It's not easy. And by the way, I get accused a lot of making things sound very easy, and they're not. And I'm not attempting to do that. I'm just trying to, you know, be as clear as I can about what's needed, like to do these things to meet your short-term goals without jeopardizing the long-term relationship is difficult. It's a fine line to walk, but it can be done. And it's really important that it is done. Okay. The third myth is that you have to keep emotions out of negotiation. Now, when I say that, and typically I will ask people, do you agree with that? They will say yes, and I will ask them why. And they will say, because if you get too angry or too frustrated or too confused or whatever, then that can derail a negotiation. And you would be right about that. So, but the problem is that human beings are logical and emotional creatures. We're both. I mean, if you don't think so, I don't know. I mean, if I were to tell you, let's keep logic out of our negotiations, you would think I'm an idiot. And similarly, you know, if we try to keep emotions out of negotiation, they find their way back in. In fact, the challenge is that we tend to suppress emotions, and when we suppress them, that's when they come in an unproductive way. So better to think, I have to find a way to manage the emotions that are arising. So if you're frustrated, it's okay to communicate that. You know, it's interesting because a lot of times people will say to me when it comes to negotiation, well, what should I do or say? And how do I act? And in part, you have to be you. That's the foundation. There's no way to fake it till you make it. You can fake it till you make it for a little while, but eventually that facade falls away. And so, you know, in the Bay Path program, for example, we talk very much about, you know, you have to understand your strengths and weaknesses and utilize those to the best of your ability. And so you have to be who you are. But when it comes to the emotional side of things, what that means is bringing your emotions into the process with some control. Because if you don't, then they will destroy a process, et cetera. So what I would say, and the reason why I believe this is a myth, is that, you know, I've seen lots of people try to keep emotions out of negotiation and it simply doesn't work. They confuse that with managing emotions or letting emotions overwhelm them. And we certainly don't want that to happen. We don't want our anger to overwhelm us. So what we want to do is have a technique, which we'll talk about, of being able to step away and say, okay, I'm clearly angry here. What's going on and how am I going to deal with this so that I can keep, you know, trying to achieve the objective that's set out. Difficult. As most of my students say, if I could just keep my damn emotions out of the picture, this would be a lot easier. And the reality is you can't. So it's more of a question of, and this is why the world of emotional intelligence, and it sounds like, you know, from Laura that you've delved into some of that, and is so critical, and why it's become so important, and why it's become something that organizations are investing in terms of their folks, because the emotional side of this is what makes this difficult. So the reality is that emotions are going to find their way in. Better to manage them effectively and bring them in with some control and know when it is that you should say and do something and when you shouldn't, when you should step away and take a break. And like I said, we'll get to that as we go. Okay, so let me just talk about a few barriers. Let me check on how we're doing on time here. Okay. So let me just talk about a few barriers, or let me pause. Any questions about any of those from folks thus far? Any of those barriers, any disagreement? Okay, good. Okay, and by the way, I'm fine, you know, when we, after today, when we finish, if you do have some questions, I'm fine for Laura to share my email, and you can ask them to me via email, and I'd be happy to reply to some of those, given I know we have some limited time here. Okay. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of barriers to success when it comes to negotiation. And I want to share just a few with you. And the first one is mapping the parties. And I don't know if you can see down the bottom, some of the text is in white. It's a little bit hard to see, but it says on the left-hand side of your screen, it says your constituents, and on the right-hand side, it says their constituents, just to be clear. So in most negotiations, so this tool is called the three parties of negotiation, or the three tables of negotiation. And so the primary table is the one on top, and that's where the main negotiators sit, if you will, right? So yourself and the other person, or other people, if there's more than one person involved. So, and we typically think of our negotiations as that, just that table and those people involved. But the reality is that that's not what negotiation looks like. Negotiations are actually a lot more complicated than they appear on the surface. So in most negotiations, we have a table of people that are sitting behind us that either have an interest in the outcome or a direct stake in what happens. So if you were to think of a negotiation that you're engaged in, and you were to think about the people that it either directly impacted or indirectly had some kind of an effect on, you could see that there'd be a number of people sort of sitting at that metaphorical table behind you. And it might be your boss, it might be some coworkers, it might be others, who knows, you know, depending on the situation. And so one of the things that I typically will say to folks is it's really important to get internal alignment when it comes to your negotiation. So before you go to the negotiating table, really useful to actually meet with folks who, like I said, have either a direct stake in what you're doing, or what you do will impact them. So that might be, like I said, your boss, a colleague, a technical expert, things along those lines, so that when you meet with them and talk to them about what are some of the red lines, what are the challenges that exist for you when it comes to this, and let me make sure I keep those in mind. Because if you don't do it beforehand, then you end up having to do it after. So, you know, I see this a lot with labor management talks. So union reps who fail to go to their union and understand their needs really well are often doomed to fail. They'll reach an agreement with management, and then they'll come back and the union will be like, this is totally not acceptable to us. So instead of that, instead of doing it that way, much better to actually have those conversations so that you know what the parameters are for other folks. And on the flip side, and equally important, is that the other person that you're negotiating with also has those internal constraints. And I see this quite a bit where the person that I'm dealing with is not, most of the time, is actually not the problem. It's their boss, is somebody they have to take this issue back to. And they don't really know how, they don't know how they would sell it to them, etc. Now, it's not always easy to know who those people are at the table. And in fact, what ends up happening in the negotiation is that those people sometimes will appear during the process over time. So, you know, that negotiator will reveal that one of their problems or their constraints is that, you know, that they've got this individual that they've got to go back to, and they don't really know how to do that. So by using this, and I use this at the beginning of a negotiation to try to get a lay of the land, and then I'll keep thinking about it, especially the folks behind them, And I'll keep trying to figure out if there's something happening at that table, because a lot of the times it does. And that's where the issue is. And so I find, and this becomes really, really helpful if you're engaged in multi-party negotiations with a lot of different stakeholders, then you can really keep track of this and have a good sense of who's involved. Okay. So accurately mapping the parties is a really important aspect of this. So the next barrier to success is your mindset, perspective, and the assumptions that you make. So as I've talked about already, the importance of your mindset. Look, if every problem looks like a nail, you use a hammer. That's just sort of how it works in life. And so if you see that what you're doing fits that mold, then you're going to take that approach. I'm a huge believer that if you change your mindset, if you see negotiation as a problem-solving endeavor, that, and frankly, negotiation is one of the best tools we have for solving problems. If you see everything like that, then for those of you who might find negotiation a little anxiety producing, it becomes much less so, because what you learn is to say, huh, okay, so we have a problem to deal with, let's negotiate. Let me use this approach. And, you know, in general, I also find that when people are, have learned some of this and are doing this a little more strategic as opposed to from the seat of their pants, which is how most people negotiate who have never taken a course or training, they begin to realize that there's a process that they can use and follow. And by the end of this, you will have a bit of a process that you can follow. So be conscious of your mindset. It matters a lot. And your perspective and the assumptions that you bring to the table also matter tremendously. We fail to realize a lot of the time that the way we view something, the way we see a situation is not how everybody sees it. If some of you are, just as an example, from, you know, have a background or a discipline in environmental studies or healthcare or whatever, that's the prism through which you see the world. And not everybody sees the world that way. And that causes you to make assumptions. And your assumptions are sort of, I like to say that assumptions are the silent killers of effective negotiation, because we make them all the time and the other side has no idea we're doing it. And before we know it, we're having a very different conversation than the other person, because in general, they don't know what we're talking about. And Laura just mentioned, it sounds like the reason chapter from last month. So there's a connection for you, if that makes sense. But I see this all the time where people will look at a situation and begin down the road of negotiating. And in fact, about a month and a half ago, I was working with a colleague. We were actually using Zoom to talk, and I thought we were talking about the budget. And the more that we negotiated, which is what it was all about, we ultimately realized that we weren't talking about the same thing. They were talking about the fact that we were having a hard time working together, and I was talking about the budget. And eventually we figured it out, but it took a little bit of figuring and discussion. And somebody mentioned, you know, asking questions is a really good idea. There's another tool that is sort of on your screen that I want to share, and it's called the ladder of inference. I don't know, Laura, have you guys talked about this?
We have not.
So the ladder of inference was a tool developed by a guy named Chris Argyris, who taught at MIT and Harvard. And basically, the ladder is a way of understanding why and how it is that people end up with very different conclusions about things and how they got there. And this is a very valuable thing when it comes to negotiation, because, so if you look at the ladder on your screen, the way the ladder works is basically two people start out and they're looking at observable data and experiences. Okay, so that we have a situation that happens in front of us or through data or whatever it might be. And we select, as you can see, the next rung of the ladder is that we're privy to an experience or a situation, a negotiation comes up, we have a conflict, whatever, right? So we know what that data and experience looks like. The next rung of the ladder is that we choose data from that big pot to notice and to pay attention to and to observe. So when a situation happens, there's an interesting study at Stanford that was done 4 years ago that basically said that in any situation we find ourselves in, no matter what it is in life, we notice about 30% of what's happening, which means that there's 70% of that data that we could have looked at that we're not noticing. Okay? So it's easy for people to look at a situation and say, okay, you know, I'm going to look at this and I assume that the other side is looking at the same element of what we're doing, right? So what happens is people select that data, select that information, and then they move up to the next rung where they add meaning. And they say, if in fact, this is what I'm noticing from the data, then that must mean this, right? So I add either a cultural meaning or personal meaning to that data. The minute we start adding interpretation to data, it ceases to become data only. It's data with interpretation, or our bent on the data, right? And when I see data conflicts, I do a lot of work with engineers, for example, and there are a lot of data conflicts, not solely about the data, but more about the interpretation of the data. Like, is a project possible based on what I'm seeing? And you'll get engineers who, one person will say yes, based on their experience, and the other person will say no, that they tried doing this in another place and it didn't work. So you add your meaning, whatever that might be, is the next rung, which leads you to make certain assumptions, almost like, you know, back to the ugly orange, that you made an assumption that you needed the 2,000 oranges. We didn't notice, we didn't select the data that said the juice or the rind. We noticed other things, right? And so once we've made an assumption about the deal, then we draw a conclusion. And when we draw that conclusion, we adopt beliefs about the world, and then we take actions based on that belief, right? And that happens not only for the other party in negotiation, but it happens for you without you realizing that's going on. So the way in which, so this becomes a problem, and it's an unspoken problem because people don't talk about it, they don't realize it. Like, making assumptions is a normal way of managing the world every day, right? And yet a lot of it is unspoken, and so it can create challenges. And so when we get into negotiations, I don't know if you've ever had a scenario where you've been negotiating with somebody and they've reached a really different conclusion about what's possible. Well, their ladder is really different. At a certain point, they've made an assumption or a series of assumptions that you didn't make, which is why they've drawn these conclusions. And so the way that I use this tool is to remind myself that, okay, in this negotiation, we've got a really okay. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? I'm sure you can think of examples where that's happened. This dovetails with something that we see a lot in negotiation, which is what's called the intent and impact problem. So people in a negotiation have a certain intention. They take an action with an intention. Often it's to solve a problem, right? Or to be productive. But the impact of that action on us can be viewed as negative. And in fact, think about a time when you tried to be respectful to someone and they took it as disrespect, right? Most of us have had that experience where that's transpired. And that's because their ladder is somewhere else. There's a divergence that's gone on there. Okay? Any questions about that?
Josh, how does asking questions help with assumptions and breaking those down?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think when you ask a question, it reveals, essentially some of the things that people are thinking when they otherwise wouldn't share that. So for me, like back to that intent and impact thing, when I get an email from somebody that has a line or a phrase or something in it that strikes me as offensive, which, the rule with email is if it can be misinterpreted, it will be, right? So instead of reacting and saying, what the hell, I'll go back and say, so can you tell me a little bit more? You made this comment or this statement. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you were trying to get at there, or what you were trying to say? Because the impact on me was actually kind of negative, and I'm thinking maybe that's not what you intended. And so by asking questions, you're really you're getting them to reveal the assumptions that went into all of that and their way of thinking about things. Does that fit, Laura? Or, I mean, for me, that's the purpose, because there's a lot that's not spoken when it comes to our interactions. I mean, so much is not spoken that, frankly, I think communication really should have been called miscommunication, because more often than not, we're misunderstanding each other. It's rare when we really fully understand what someone's trying to tell us and the way they're trying to tell us it. So a couple questions. Let's see. Is there a point on the ladder where you recommend we start asking questions? So I think what ends up happening is somebody will say something and they'll make a statement and you'll think to yourself, I have no idea how they got there. And that's the point at which you want to say, so I think we've drawn really different conclusions about this. Can you help me to understand why you think that's the best course of action, for example, right? And what that's going to do is that's going to be the place where they're starting down the road of an action-oriented thing. But what it's going to do is bring you back to the assumptions that they're making. And so Jen was saying that your manager does this a lot to help me understand. And if they do, that's great. It's really important that when you're communicating, you're not, especially when it comes to decision making. I mean, here's the dovetail with leadership, which is that, if you're communicating a decision, it's really important that you don't just say, here's what I've decided, let's get on it, and here's why. Let me share with you some of the logic and the thinking, because when you understand the reasoning behind things, it can be very valuable, and kind of brings you into their ladder on some level. It helps you to say, okay, so the reason that they're suggesting this course of action is because of X, Y, and Z. And now that makes sense to me. Whereas if I didn't know why they were suggesting X, Y, and Z, I don't know how to get on board or why I should get on board. But now they understand, the data they looked at and the meaning they added, et cetera, makes it easier for me to say, okay, I get this. This makes sense. Let's go forward. So negotiation is very much about outcome, but it's also about process. And one tidbit of advice that I can give you is that it's far more valuable to bring a difficult person into the negotiation process than to leave them out. If you leave somebody out of a process that they think they should be involved in, they will spend a lot of time trying to disrupt it, as opposed to getting their voice in, at the table. And even if it's difficult, which it will be, it will be worse if you leave them out of a scenario where they think they should be part of the equation. Okay. Okay. So one of the other barriers that I think is valuable to highlight is really speaking the other person's language. This goes back to, sort of perceptions and assumptions, but when we're trying to persuade people, which is, I mean, in negotiation, our biggest tool is persuasion. Especially, if we're trying to build a long-term relationship, et cetera. And so for most of us, when I ask people, how do you go about persuading people? They will usually say, well, I try to make a logical case, or I try to think like them, right? And Laura just, put something in there about advocacy. So for many years, I kind of kept thinking to myself, okay, I get that part of persuasion, but it feels like there's more to the story. And I don't know, about 10 years ago, I came across Aristotle's work called Rhetoric, which he had written 2,300 years ago. Some of you may be familiar with it. But if you're not, in that work, he lays out 3 elements of persuasion. And the first one is logos. So logos is the logical piece of persuading someone. It's laying out your case. But here's an interesting piece of this, which is that when a lot of us try to persuade people, we tend to do it from our own point of view, from our perspective, as opposed to the perspective of the person that we're trying to persuade. So if somebody, if you're trying to negotiate with somebody and persuade them, are you thinking about the language you need to use to do that? Do they understand your world or not really? And if they don't understand your world, how do you use their language to get through to them? Okay, so logos is one, and in particular in the US, I think it was, well, I think it's fair to say that that used to be the norm for how we would go about persuading people. Given our current atmosphere, I'm not sure about facts and logic and data anymore when it comes to things. I think there's, things have been thrown into question there. So, and frankly, I think we've moved a little more into some of these other realms. So the next part of persuading people is ethos. Ethos is the credibility that you bring to the table, the trustworthiness that you have. So are you, and the way that I would translate in this into negotiation is, are you the right messenger? Are you the right person to deliver this or not? Do you have the credibility? So when I first started working at Harvard, I quote unquote only had my master's degree, and I was working on a project with 3 faculty members. And one of the faculty members just whatever, and I was working on this day to day, they were kind of the advisory committee. And I remember that one of the faculty members, it was clear for whatever reason, they just didn't really take my word for things. Whereas the other 2 faculty members recognized that I was working on this every day and kind of deferred to me and said, that sounds like Josh has got his act together here, et cetera. But this one other faculty member just was not persuaded. And the more that I learned about him, the more that I learned that he was very much about credentials and credibility. And so I realized, because I didn't have a PhD or a JD, that this was going to be an uphill battle. This was going to be a challenge, and I probably wasn't the right messenger. So what I did was, one of the other faculty members, so when I realized that, I went to one of the other faculty members and I said, listen, I'd like to kind of bounce some ideas off of you. And if you think that this is the right way to go, I would appreciate you sharing that in our meetings. Because what I was sensing was, if this person would advocate on behalf of these ideas, they would be much more likely to get through than if I was the primary person trying to advance something. And it worked. Basically, the other person said, listen, I absolutely trust you and your opinion on this and your advice. So whatever you put forward, let me know, and I'm happy to help. And I noticed almost immediately that there was a change. And so what it took was recognizing that I was not the right messenger, because I didn't have that credibility. And I deferred to somebody else because I still believed this was the right way to go down a certain road. And so I thought, well, what tools are at my disposal when it comes to that? Now, the last piece of this persuasion framework is pathos. And pathos is the emotional bond or connection that you create with the other person. And we tend not to use pathos nearly enough. One of the best ways of persuading people is through stories. Stories stay with us. They're much more powerful than theories or concepts, particularly in my mind. In fact, the reason that I wrote the book that's coming out in August about real world case studies was I wanted to tell people stories. I didn't want to say to people, look, I think you're a little bit off in your understanding of negotiation, and there are these traditional ways of thinking about it. I think you're kind of stuck there. What I wanted to do was show people and say, look, instead of me trying to convince you, let me just show you what effective negotiation looks like. So stories and creating emotional connections with people, particularly when it comes to worry, fear, concern, which are drivers in negotiation, is really powerful and really beneficial. And so as a quick example, I mentioned that I do a good bit of work with engineers. It was about 5 years ago, I was out in Denver doing a training with this company, and I kind of presented this framework to the group. And a woman came up to me and she said, you know what, I finally realized what the problem is between me and a client. So basically, they had this problem, this challenge from an engineering point of view, and she had designed this really beautiful solution from a logos point of view. Okay, the client that she was working with was not very savvy, didn't really understand the engineering world. And so she said, I realized two things. One, I was laying out this really well thought out case from a logical point of view, and from my world. I wasn't connecting to her world, which was one where she worked for the city and was really a neophyte when it came to engineering, right? But she said, much more importantly, so she said, I've been trying to persuade her for 3 months to go down this road, and she keeps saying no, and I don't know why. And she said, I think I just figured it out. And she said, on a number of occasions, she's mentioned to me that she's worried and concerned about this approach. And she said, I never once addressed the worry or concern. I went right to logos as part of the conversation. And she said, had I stepped back and I think addressed that and explained how this would help to deal with the worry, concern, or fear that she has about this, I sense she would have been a lot more receptive to my logical case. I said, makes sense. Why don't you try it and let me know? So a week later, I got an email from her saying, basically, voila, that the minute that she said, listen, you know, you hired me to manage this and I've got your back. Like this is not the first time I've seen this kind of a problem. And so I will solve this. I just need you to try to get on board with what I'm sharing with you, et cetera. And she said, the minute I told her that she very quickly agreed. So one of the things that happens in negotiation, as I mentioned, is that people are afraid, concerned, or worried about something. Are they going to look stupid? They don't know how to go back to their boss, whatever it might be. And if you want to persuade them, you need to use these different tools. In an ideal world, you would use all three of these at once. But the more you listen to people, and for me in negotiation, people often talk about the best negotiators are the sort of smoothest talkers or the best communicators in that regard. And I would actually say that I disagree. I think the best negotiators ask the best questions and they listen really carefully, because information is the currency of negotiation. The more you have, the more you know, the more ways in which you can begin to address the real problem. And so, from where I sit, that's the skill set that's really critical. And people, if you're patient, and it's interesting because I also notice that people, when it comes to negotiation, don't seem to be very patient. They want to get the process over as fast as they can. I'm like, what is your hurry? Slow down. Because when you slow down, information reveals itself. If you ask questions, if somebody says something, you say, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Like, that's the first time you mentioned it. And they say, well, yeah, like this is important. Okay, well, now I know something else just emerged that's important that nobody had mentioned before, right? So if you're patient and you listen and you ask good questions, what you find is that the information that you need will be forthcoming, but it requires a slowing the process down and not pushing the issue, if you will. Okay. Okay, let me just try to address these last two barriers, and I think I have to stop for now, and then we'll pick back up this afternoon. There's two more barriers. So one of the things that happens, Laura, do I have much fudge room? Like, can I go 5 minutes over?
Depends on the class.
Okay. Well, let me I'll try to cover this, and if I go through it a little quickly, and when we pick back up this afternoon, if you've got questions about it, you can ask them then. So basically, one of the things that I hear a lot from people is, one of the real challenges in negotiation is that I don't, it's very hard for me to know what the other person is going to do or how they're going to do it in a negotiation. And so there's a lot of sort of mystifying behavior, if you will, and it's confusing. And so one way to try to cut through that is to understand that there are different negotiation styles. Now, different negotiation styles can be a barrier to success because let's just take two. So as you can see, there are 5 styles, 5 approaches to negotiation. And in essence, on the left-hand side of your screen, you see there's sort of the concern for self, or how much you're willing to assert for your interests and needs. And then the low to high concern on the top is basically concern for the relationship, how much emphasis you place on the relationship. So if we were to just take 2 styles, just as an example of how this can be a barrier, if you had a competitor and an accommodator negotiating together, they're very likely to reach agreement, but it's probably not going to be an agreement that is going to be satisfying to both parties. In fact, it will very likely be that the competitor will be happy, they'll get what they want, and the accommodator will be okay because they reached an agreement, because accommodators place a high value on the relationship and less on what's important to them, whereas a competitor places a lot on what's important to them and not as much on the relationship. So, and in fact, many competitors love to work with accommodators because they always get what they want, right? The problem is that eventually accommodators lose interest, because when you never have your interests met or your needs met, right, you're like, okay, you know what, this really isn't very satisfying. And so you might have an individual who works at a company for a while and then says, you know what, I'm leaving because I'm never getting any of my interests met in all of this. So styles can be problematic. If you know about these negotiation styles, they can also be helpful. So the one way in which this can be helpful is if I know I'm dealing with a competitor, then or if I'm looking across the table and I say to myself, I'm wondering, what this person's approach is going to be. And if they're really direct and very assertive and leaning in and doing all of those things, then I have a pretty good sense that this person I'm negotiating with has a competing approach. And I take it that way. I don't take it as, an overbearing personality. I just say, this is their style. And so it helps me to depersonalize it. But if you don't know that, then negotiation styles can really get in the way and become a huge barrier to success. Okay. And we can talk more about that in the end. The last thing I want to mention before we stop is that a huge barrier, as I've already alluded to, is the internal elements of negotiation. And when I say that, it's those things within you that are guiding your behavior in some way, shape, or form. And what these biases are all about is really, in many ways, creating a problem or a fear in you and leading to you negotiating with yourself, talking yourself out of ever having certain conversations because you're worried about what will happen. So for an accommodator, for example, the accommodator might say, I'd really like this, but if I were to raise this issue, they'll get angry, they'll start yelling, and that's going to make me anxious. And so I'm just not going to do it. Like the whole story, the whole narrative plays itself out in your mind as opposed to with the other person, right? So negotiating with yourself is very real. Most of us do it when we get that voice in our head that says, well, if I was to ask for that, this is what would happen. And so I can't do that, and yada, yada, yada. So a lot of the challenge in negotiation rests within your head and the way that you're thinking about things and the way that you're processing what might happen if you were to raise this issue or question. So I mentioned those. I'm happy. Somebody else said, can we talk more about how to identify someone's negotiation style? Yes, we can. So I'm going to leave it there because I know you all have other things to do, and we'll pick this